Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Naruto Shippuden, Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a 3D fighting game, the follow-up to Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm Revolution, and the direct sequel to Ultimate Ninja Storm 3 Full Burst. It was developed by CyberConnect 2 and published by Bandai Namco in February of last year for all three systems, and it actually is the last game in the Naruto Ultimate Ninja series. They finally got around to finishing the entire storyline of Naruto Shippuden, as well as of course Naruto in general, because believe it or not, the series has actually ended. The manga ended back in 2014, and they finally finished up the anime earlier this year, which means that there's no more Naruto storyline to deal with in terms of video games. So, what they're doing instead is focusing on the sequel series, which is Boruto. Now, I will talk about that more later on in the video because I'll also be going over the Road to Boruto expansion pack that was released for this game. But until we get to that point, I'm going to be focusing on the actual Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 and what it does compared to its predecessors and how it actually rounds out the series. So without further ado, let's go ahead and delve right into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here. Well, as far as presentation goes, it's actually practically indistinguishable from the previous two games in the series. It uses a lot of the same models, a lot of the same animations, a lot of the same stages, and unfortunately it ends up being a bit of a been there, done that sort of scenario. Now, of course, given the art style, they can kind of get away with that because, let's face it, it's an anime art style. It's styled completely after the actual show, so it looks very fitting for what it is. It's just that you don't really get a serious upgrade in visual quality between this and the predecessors. What does change pretty dramatically, though, is that they put in a 60 frames per second option for this particular game. Except there's one problem with that. This game never runs at 60 frames a second. First thing I did when I started this game up was I went into story mode with the 60 frames per second option on. The game was running in slow motion. I even have footage of that to show you here. I'm not sure why it was running in slow motion, but it was running in slow motion. So I switched it back over to 30 frames per second and suddenly everything worked perfectly fine. So I decided to test it on a smaller scale because the battle that I was doing in the single player story mode was frankly kind of over the top. So I have a side-by-side comparison of a 60 frames per second battle with a 30 frames per second battle featuring the same characters and same stage and everything. And there's even a frame rate counter running in the top left portion of the screen. Now, of course, when I put it to 30 frames per second, the game always runs at 30 frames per second. But if I put it to 60, it fluctuates. You'll see it going between 50 and 60, but not ever actually hitting 60. Occasionally it even goes down a bit further than that, but you will notice that while some of the animations are a bit smoother in 60 frames per second, others are more in slow motion. This means that even if you're like me and you much prefer 60 frames per second in your games, then you will probably keep this locked at 30 frames per second because then it's a consistent gameplay experience. If you put it to 60 frames per second, the frame timings actually change with the frame rate, so it becomes a very frustrating experience when you're trying to do moves that normally you're perfectly fine doing, but if you have the 60 frames per second enabled, then the timing is going to be off and you're going to be like, wait a minute, why didn't this work? So on the one hand, I appreciate the fact that they did put in a 60 frames per second option, but the 60 frames per second option they put in was lazily done and does not work very well. But you know what, at least they put all of the graphics options in the game this time, as opposed to having them in a separate launcher application when you start the game, so there's progress there at least. But before I go into whether or not the sound design improved over the previous games, I do have to mention something that is incredibly irritating to me, which is that this game is censored. And I don't mean that it's censored in the sense of one region has one particular version and the other region has another particular version. I mean that no matter which version of the game you're playing, all of the blood has been turned black and there is no dismemberment whatsoever. Now you may be thinking to yourself, but DW, the previous games in the series weren't particularly bloody and gory either. That's correct. But in this particular instance it's especially insulting because there are actually plot points that do revolve around characters getting severely injured. I'm going to go ahead and warn you about a spoiler that I'm going to be a bit vague about, but if you do not want any spoilers whatsoever, then you might want to skip ahead to the time code that I'm showing you right now. But for those of you who don't care, there is one particular part in the series where two characters end up fighting each other and actually blow each other's arms off with a particularly powerful attack. Now, in both the anime and the manga, this is not a particularly graphic scene. They have stumps where their arms used to be, and there's no bones sticking out or anything of that nature. It's just some blood spilling out of the wound. Now, I'm not going to spoil what ramifications this has for the plot itself, but as far as how they handle it in the game, they don't remove the arm. Instead, they put a black texture over the arm, and there's a very small amount of black liquid on the ground where their arm is actually laying. You can very easily see the arm there. It is painfully obvious, and even worse, later on during a cutscene, where they're not supposed to have their arms, you see the arm just hanging there, it just has a black texture on it. It looks completely and utterly ridiculous. If it were just the fact that they turned the blood black, then I would be able to put that aside and say, okay, it's annoying, but I can deal with it. But the fact that they just censored dismemberment by saying, okay, we're just going to put a black texture over the limb that is supposed to be missing is just insulting to your intelligence. Especially when that dismemberment has plot ramifications and also even some imagery implications that are kind of ruined when you don't have the arms missing and the blood pooling and such like that. So if the reason that they censored it is because of the Japanese rating system, then the Japanese rating system is bullshit. Anyway, with that mini rant out of the way, let's actually talk about the sound design, which is pretty much unchanged from the last two games in the series. There is new voice acting for the new characters that are introduced in this particular game, but beyond that, there's really nothing in here that you haven't seen in the previous two games in the series. In fact, almost all of it is directly ripped from those games. Same thing goes for the sound effects and the music, and when you bring it all together, it is definitely very fitting for the source material, but it's really disappointing that they didn't actually up the ante with the sound design in this one versus the others. I mean, there's only so much they can do with the voice acting, but they could have at least made the sound effects harder hitting or improved the music somewhat. Instead, we just get more of the same, and while it's certainly not bad by any stretch of the imagination, it's just not particularly great either. But when you bring everything together, you find that the presentation is certainly competent enough, but it's not really all that impressive, and more importantly, it's rather disappointing if you played previous games in the series, and you see that it's not really improved much at all since the previous games. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. Now, the story in this is split into three different sections. The first is the main story mode, second is the adventures mode, and if you have the Road to Boruto expansion, then there's also the Boruto's Tale storyline that you can go into. But I won't cover the Road to Boruto expansion until later on in this video. Let's first talk about the base game. It takes place after the events of Ultimate Ninja Storm 3 Full Burst, and that basically means that it's still following the events of the anime and the manga, and it brings everything to the conclusion of the Naruto Shippuden anime series, as well as, of course, Naruto the manga. Here's the problem with that. By the time you hit the events that this covers, everything has gone completely bonkers, and nothing makes sense anymore. It is absolutely rampant with Deus Ex Machina, as well as just absurd amounts of power creep. I mean, it was bad enough when they got to the Naruto and Pain fight, and while they're certainly ridiculously powerful at that point, it was still somewhat within the power levels we had seen throughout the previous course of the manga and anime. Once you go into the later events of Ultimate Ninja Storm 3 Full Burst, as well as the entirety of what happens in Ultimate Ninja Storm 4, half of the characters are throwing around abilities that could practically destroy an entire planet just with a single strike, and yet they're just throwing them around left, right, and center like it's nothing. Not to mention the hilarious amount of, "This isn't even my final form, mortals." It's to the point where it is literally impossible to feel tension throughout the course of a battle because you know exactly what's going to happen. And then there are the pitiful excuses of story twists that they try to throw in there to justify fighting yet another more powerful enemy. It just got completely exhausting. And all of that is on full display here in Ultimate Ninja Storm 4. Now, as far as adapting the source material, it does a pretty decent job of that, but the source material was just so run out by this point that there was really no point in finishing it unless you felt obligated to finish it because you'd been there since the beginning. And the fact that the violence is so heavily censored in this means that, frankly, you would be better served just watching the anime or reading the manga for this particular bit of the story. Now, that's not to say that the story mode itself is bad. It's not necessarily bad. It's much the same as you've seen from the previous Ultimate Ninja Storm games. Most of the fighting will be done in a one-on-one fight, mostly against boss characters that have numerous health bars you have to deplete, but sometimes not. And when you're not doing that, you're going to be doing basically one of two other things. You're either going to be doing a mob battle, which, as far as I remember, there's only one in the entire game, which is really disappointing. Or you're going to be doing a battle where it's a cutscene, and depending on the speed with which you're able to go through the QTEs, it's going to trigger a special factor, which is basically just going to be a still image from the anime popping up and then some narration going over it. This all means that there's really nothing new as far as the story mode goes, and if anything, there's actually less variety than Ultimate Ninja Storm 3 Full Burst had. This means that the story mode ends up wearing itself thin fairly quickly, and you end up actually getting very tired of it by the end. Because at that point, you've just been worn down so much by the blatant plot holes and the Deus Ex Machina and the absurdity of the story, and on top of that, the gameplay is pretty much the same thing over and over and over again, which is admittedly what you'd expect in a fighting game, but still, the story modes of this series are known for having some degree of variety, and this one barely has any at all. There is one thing they do with the story mode that is a bit interesting, which is that it gives you a second chance if you do manage to lose a fight. So if you lose, then it goes to a screen where you can select one of two paths. One path refills all of your health and gives you a defensive boost, and the other path gives you a full recharge of your health, of course, as well as an attack boost. And then the enemy is actually left at whatever health they had when you fell down. This means that if you're having a really rough time with a specific fight and you end up going down, it's not the end of the world, and you can actually end up having a fighting chance there. Which is something that I had to use toward the end of the story mode, because the battles eventually got to the point where the boss fights were just BS. It was the problem of the enemy just blocking or dodging every single thing you throw at it and dishing out ridiculous amounts of damage with every single combo, so it got pretty frustrating when that sort of thing started happening, and it was a good thing that it gives you the option to use the defensive boost as opposed to just going in and having one shot with it. For those of you who say, oh well, DW, you just suck at the game, I really don't care. This is not exactly something that's going to be a very big competitive fighting game. It really doesn't matter how good you are at it. Especially considering that the boost options are only available in the story modes, so it's only in a single player context. You never have to worry about it from a multiplayer context. Speaking of only being present in the story mode, there's also the ability to run around the towns in the adventure mode as well as in the Road to Boruto expansion. This allows you to run around and find various items scattered around the world, as well as complete various side quests and side activities that will give you various rewards. Thing is, it is only in the Adventures mode and the Road to Boruto expansion. That does not occur during the actual story mode, which means that it's a bit of a waste. Because, to put it quite simply, the adventure mode is just not very good. All of the actual storylines for the adventure mode are side stories that are non-canon, so they don't really have any impact on the actual story. You learn pretty much nothing about the actual world of Naruto or anything that's going on with the characters, and they are actually set after the events of the story mode anyway. So you might as well just think of them as filler arcs, and they're really not very good filler arcs. It is something to do after the story mode ends, though, unless you have the Road to Boruto expansion, in which case you'll probably go through that just for the story of that. But don't worry, we'll get there when we get there. But really, that's kind of it. There's not that much story content in the base game. You do have the story mode and you do have the adventure mode, but beyond that, it's just a series of free battles. Of course, that's perfectly fine because this is a fighting game after all, but it is still a bit disappointing that there isn't a bit more story content here. This does mean that the vast majority of this game is going to come down to its gameplay for you, and the gameplay is barely changed over the previous games in the series. You're either in one-on-one battles or team battles, and if you're in a team battle, then you're going to find that your storm gauge is going to go up as you take damage and as you dish out damage and call in support ninjutsu. Once your storm meter has filled up entirely, then you can either go into awakening mode, or you can actually use it to get a secret linked ninjutsu. Now, the secret ninjutsu is just the ultimate ninjutsu from previous games, so that's unchanged. It's a particularly powerful ninjutsu, and the linked ninjutsu is just a team ninjutsu. The Awakening mode is much the same as in previous games as well. You get increased damage output, and of course you get special abilities that are mapped to the D-pad as well. So there's only very slight alterations to those particular mechanics, and there's also a slight alteration in that you can actually switch between yourself and your various support characters. This means that there are actually no more dedicated support characters. Everybody is a fighter, and you just stick everybody in the team and you can switch between them whenever you want to. This brings me to a slight correction I have to make for my Ultimate Ninja Storm Revolution review, where I mentioned that you could switch between characters. You cannot in Ultimate Ninja Storm Revolution. It's only in Ninja Storm 4. So sorry if that was confusing at all. But regardless, this is going to feel very familiar if you've played any of the previous Ultimate Ninja Storm games, and particularly if you've played Ultimate Ninja Storm 3 or Revolution, it's going to feel very, very samey. It is, however, going to feel a bit faster paced as well as a bit more refined, which is really what they did. They just polished up the gameplay from the previous games and implemented a few slightly different mechanics here and there. None of it is enough to dramatically affect the way the game plays out, but it is enough to notice it if you played the previous games. This does mean that Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 does feel like the most refined game out of the series as far as its raw fighting mechanics go. But at the same time, it still suffers from the same problems that those do, which is that it is a very simplistic fighting game that is really all about flash and not so much about substance. There's not a lot of depth to the fighting system, and it really does exist to show off a bunch of really flashy, over-the-top moves, especially once you get into the secret ninjutsu side of things, where things get completely over-the-top and ridiculous. This means that the core fighting mechanics are fairly shallow, and it does wear thin relatively quickly unless you're a fan of the source material. Now, I'm not really what I would describe as a fan of the source material, but at least in the context that this game is putting forth, it works out pretty well. A ridiculous series like Naruto does lend itself very well to a over-the-top, flashy fighting game that doesn't have a whole lot of substance. And there are plenty of characters to work with in that series as well, so they've got plenty of options for the roster, and the roster is indeed rather ridiculously huge. Now granted, none of the characters really play all that wildly different from one another, although there are a couple that are centered primarily around projectiles rather than melee attacks, so that's the main difference you'll run into. But beyond those, you're really not going to have that much variety in the characters other than actual visuals. This means that it mostly comes down to personal preference as to which characters you want to play, just based on how they look and whether or not you actually watch the anime or read the manga and know the characters and like the characters from that. Now obviously that does have the secondary effect of limiting the appeal of this to people who are familiar with the source material and people especially who are fans of the source material. But it does also mean that the game is actually quite accessible to new players because they can jump in and just about play any character without worrying about whether or not they need to learn the movesets or anything of that nature. Because all of the movesets are very comparable to one another, it's just some very slight variations between each individual character. Some of them have slightly longer combos, some of them have slightly shorter combos, for example. But it's not so different that switching between characters is going to be some massive difference. It's going to be, oh, well, this is very slightly different, I got this. This makes it a very casual fighting game. It is very easy to pick up and play, and you can just hop in, play a few rounds, and feel relatively satisfied despite the mechanics not being particularly strong. Now, that doesn't change the fact that they still haven't sorted out the camera that this series has been plagued with the entire time, and that sometimes gets in your way if you get lost as to where your character was on the screen. And it also doesn't change the fact that the fighting mostly devolves into substitution jutsu after substitution jutsu until you eventually run out of the meter for it, and then you just start getting smacked upside the head repeatedly. But of course that is endemic in the way they've set up the fighting mechanics, so the only way they'd be able to fix that is if they completely overhauled them. And of course if you expected them to do that with the final game in the Ultimate Ninja Storm series, then that is extremely naive. It's much more reasonable to expect them to refine the existing gameplay mechanics, which is exactly what they did. They just didn't do it enough to make it a significant improvement over the previous games. It's a good thing then that there is a decent amount of content on offer here, about the same that you would see in the previous Ultimate Ninja Storm games. You'll get a pretty decent amount of hours out of the story mode, although less than you would have in the previous games, and you'll also be able to throw in a few hours into the adventure mode as well. Beyond that, there is of course free battle, where you can just go in and do a basic versus match, whether it's one character versus one character, or a team of characters versus another team of characters, or the various other modes that they have available in the free battle, like the tournament or league play. And then of course if you're more into the multiplayer side of things, then you can certainly hop into that, and you'll probably be able to find a game, although I don't know for how much longer, because this thing doesn't really have a particularly large player base. But beyond that, the base game also has a collection that you can go through and purchase various costumes, or finish cut-in images, or various titles or ninja card images or whatever for multiplayer. And while there is definitely a lot on offer there, there's not really all that many good items in the mix, and you end up with a situation where there's a bunch of stuff to spend your in-game currency on, which you only earn by actually playing the game, I might add. It's not something where you can just buy in-game currency and then buy stuff through real money. But then there's other items that you can get that also require you to spend in-game currency on, but they also require various items that you earn by simply playing the game. Things like gold shuriken or whatever it may well be, and those tend to be the slightly more interesting unlockables. But that's all cosmetic. It's not anything that's going to actually affect the way the game plays out, and what you end up with is a base game that is solid enough, but unfortunately not really advanced further than the previous two games in the series. There are enough slight improvements to say, okay, this is pretty much the definitive game as far as its gameplay goes for the Ultimate Ninja Storm series, but beyond that, it's not really going to win you over if you weren't already a fan. The same kind of problem happens with the Road to Boruto expansion. It basically adds in an extra storyline that also has elements of the adventure mode where you can run around in a sort of in-game world to mess around with various side quests and such. The problem with this is that the story in the Road to Boruto expansion is a direct adaptation of the Road to Boruto movie, which is what leads up to the actual Boruto manga. I say this is a problem because it's set after the events of Naruto, and everything has gone completely bonkers in terms of power level and that sort of thing, so there's no tension there either. But for those of you who are die-hard fans of Naruto, then you might be able to get something out of it, because it does introduce some new characters to play around with, and of course it's more storyline for you to mess around with if you're a big fan of the single-player stuff. The thing is that the Road to Boruto expansion really doesn't add all that much to the game. It basically tosses in a few more characters and gives you a few story missions to play through, and that's really it. It's a rather low amount of content for the asking price, and that means that the only time you would ever want to get it is if it's either bundled with the game or if it's on sale. And the same thing can be said for the other DLCs for this game as well. They are really not very well thought out DLCs, and they do not do enough to add to the game to really justify getting them. The only one with any substance is the Road to Boruto expansion, and even it does not have enough content to justify the asking price. This means that about the only way I would recommend getting this game is if they ever come out with a complete version that includes all of the DLC, including the Road to Boruto expansion, or you manage to find a good deal on getting all of it bundled together. Because Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 is really nothing new to this series. It's just a refinement of things that came before, and it's presented with the later parts of the manga and anime, and that's pretty much it. If you already like the Ultimate Ninja Storm series, then you'll probably like Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 as well, but for everyone else, it's probably not going to win you over to the series. I would recommend trying to jump in with an earlier game in the series, maybe Ultimate Ninja Storm 3 Full Burst, because it's much more of a well-rounded title. This one has the innate problem of the manga and anime being completely and utterly ridiculous by this point, and the just writing in general being of a considerably lower quality than pretty much everything that preceded it. Now, of course, that's not the game's fault, it's just adapting the source material, and the source material was the problem, so there's some degree of an excuse there, but it's still hard to excuse the censorship, and it's hard to excuse the value proposition here. Because ultimately what you're dealing with is a very middle-of-the-road experience. It's not particularly good, it's not particularly bad, but if you're a fan of the Ultimate Ninja Storm series, then you'll probably be able to enjoy it. For everyone else, wait for a pretty deep discount on it. I give it a 3 out of 5. Thanks for watching.